Picture the halls of one of the greatest palaces on earth, the Great Palace of Constantinople, marble floors, gold mosaics, ambassadors from 3 continents waiting in its corridors to be received by the most powerful man in the Mediterranean world. Now picture that same man being pushed through those halls in a wheeled chair, biting at the attendants who pass too close, while musicians play organ music constantly, day and night, in every corridor, just to keep him from spiraling further. This wasn't a rumor whispered by enemies of the empire, or an exaggeration invented centuries later for entertainment. It comes from a contemporary chronicler who lived through it, describing an emperor who, by his final years in power, behaved, in the chronicler's own words, like a wild animal. Ambassadors were still arriving. Wars were still being fought in his name. And the man who was supposed to be directing all of it could no longer be trusted to move safely through his own home. His name was Justin II, Emperor of Byzantium from 565 to 578 CE. He inherited one of the most powerful thrones in the world from one of history's most consequential rulers. And this is the true story of how he lost his grip on it in absolutely every sense of the word, militarily, politically, and finally, mentally. To understand Justin, you first have to understand what he inherited. Justin became emperor in 565 CE, succeeding his uncle, Justinian the Great, arguably one of the single most consequential rulers in the entire history of Rome, east or west. Justinian had spent decades pursuing an enormous, expensive vision, reconquering lost Roman territory in Italy and North Africa from the Germanic kingdoms that had taken them over generations earlier. He'd also commissioned astonishing architectural monuments, including the Hagia Sophia, a building so ambitious for its time that it still stands today, nearly 15 centuries later. All of that had a real cost. By the time Justin took the throne, the imperial treasury was strained after decades of war spending and construction. The army was stretched thin defending territory across 3 continents, and the empire badly needed a period of consolidation and recovery, not new conflict on top of everything it was already managing. Justin ruled alongside his wife, Empress Sophia, niece of the formidable Empress Theodora, who had herself been one of the most powerful women in Roman history. Sophia inherited some of that same reputation for sharp political instinct and would end up playing a far larger, more consequential role in this story than most Byzantine empresses of her era ever did. Justin, however, did not choose consolidation. For years, the Byzantine Empire had paid an annual tribute to the Avars, a powerful nomadic confederation that had settled along the Danube frontier, essentially buying peace on that border so Justinian could focus the empire's limited resources on other priorities, including his wars of reconquest further west. Justin found this arrangement humiliating for an empire that still considered itself the direct heir of Rome. Early in his reign, he refused to continue the payments, publicly declaring that Roman strength and prestige alone should be enough to keep the Avars in check without having to pay for the privilege. It was a confident decision. It was not a well-supported one. The empire Justin had inherited didn't actually have the surplus military strength his confidence assumed. And that gap between confidence and capacity was about to be tested on more than one front at once. In 568, just 3 years into his reign, the Lombards, a Germanic people, invaded Italy. Roman forces in Italy, already thin after Justinian's costly reconquest decades earlier, and never fully replenished since, could not hold the peninsula against the new invasion. Within just a few years, the Lombards controlled most of Italy, permanently undoing a large share of what Justinian's expensive, decades-long wars had originally achieved. One front was already unraveling. Justin then opened a second one. In 572, Justin provoked a brand new war with the Sassanid Persian Empire, the Byzantine Empire's oldest and most dangerous rival, over control of Armenia and the surrounding Caucasus region, a contested borderland both empires had fought over for generations. It was, in hindsight, exactly the kind of overextension the empire could least afford, opening a difficult new war against a major power in the east, while it was still actively losing ground to the Lombards in the west, with a treasury that hadn't recovered from the last round of wars either. At first, this might have looked like ambition. What followed made it look like something closer to miscalculation. In 573, Roman forces suffered a catastrophic defeat against the Persians. They lost Dara, a heavily fortified frontier city in Mesopotamia that had guarded the eastern border for generations, a fortress so significant that both empires had spent decades and enormous resources fighting to control it. Its fall wasn't just one military setback among many. It was treated, at the time, by Romans and Persians alike, as a genuine strategic and psychological catastrophe, a symbol that the frontier itself could no longer hold. According to the Byzantine chronicler John of Ephesus, a contemporary writer who lived through these events, the news of Dara's fall broke something in Justin that never fully recovered. Before we go further, it's worth being honest about this source. John of Ephesus belonged to the Monophysite Christian sect, a group whose beliefs about the nature of Christ put them at odds with official imperial doctrine, and Justin had actively persecuted that sect during his reign. That gives John a real, documented personal motive to describe the emperor as harshly and unflatteringly as possible. Historians therefore treat his most vivid, specific details with appropriate caution rather than taking them at absolute face value. But the core claim that Justin became genuinely incapable of ruling after 572 is independently confirmed by a separate, undeniable fact. Real political power visibly and durably shifted to other hands during exactly this same period, regardless of which chronicler you trust. So what did John of Ephesus actually describe? He wrote that Justin, in his worsening episodes, behaved like a wild animal, biting the heads of attendants who came too close, thrashing against anyone who tried to restrain or guide him, and requiring a wheeled, mobile throne to be pushed through the palace corridors because he could no longer be trusted to walk or move safely on his own. And, most strikingly of all, that organ music, an instrument the Byzantines associated with grand ceremony and the imperial court, was ordered played continuously throughout the palace, day and night, in an ongoing, deliberate attempt to soothe him during these episodes, whether or not he was actively having one at that moment. Try to imagine being a palace servant in this period. The most powerful man in your world wheeled past you daily, unpredictable, sometimes violent, while music never stops playing in the background like a constant, uneasy soundtrack to an empire quietly running itself. With the emperor incapacitated, someone still had to actually govern a vast, embattled empire. That responsibility fell primarily to two people, Empress Sophia and Tiberius, a trusted military officer who commanded the palace guard, known as the executors, and whom Justin himself had promoted into that position of trust before his condition worsened. Together, largely without any formal public acknowledgement of what was actually happening, they managed the day-to-day business of running the Byzantine Empire, diplomacy, military decisions, court administration, while its emperor was, for long stretches at a time, simply unable to. This wasn't a formal regency announced to the public, with a ceremony or a title to make it official. It was a quiet, practical workaround, the kind large institutions often improvise almost invisibly when the person nominally in charge of everything simply isn't capable of actually being in charge of anything. Remarkably, Justin's condition doesn't seem to have been constant. In 574, during what historians describe as a genuine lucid interval, a stretch of clarity amid the broader pattern of decline, Justin held a formal public ceremony adopting Tiberius as Caesar and heir to the throne, effectively naming him as the man who would rule after Justin's death. Ancient historians recorded the speech he reportedly gave that day as strikingly coherent, even genuinely wise, full of specific practical advice for how Tiberius should govern, warnings about pride, reminders to treat his subjects justly, and guidance on managing the very kinds of military and financial pressures that had helped undo Justin's own reign. It's a jarring contrast, the same man biting attendants and being wheeled through palace corridors on other days, delivering thoughtful counsel on the nature of good rule on this one. Justin died in 578 after 13 years on the throne, only a handful of which he had actually spent in full command of his own faculties. Tiberius, the man he had adopted and effectively handed the day-to-day running of the empire to years earlier, succeeded him formally, taking the name Tiberius II Constantine. The transition, when it finally came, was remarkably smooth and stable, precisely because Sophia and Tiberius had already been quietly managing the empire in practice for years by that point, long before either of them held the formal authority to do so. So what does this story actually leave us with? An emperor who inherited a strained but still genuinely powerful empire made a series of confident decisions it couldn't fully back up, provoked conflict on multiple fronts at nearly the same time, and then suffered a very public, very human collapse when those decisions produced a catastrophe he wasn't equipped to process, emotionally or otherwise. None of this happened in a vacuum, either. Every decision Justin made connected to the one before it. Refusing tribute weakened his diplomatic position, fighting the Lombards drained resources he needed elsewhere, and opening a second front against Persia meant the empire had no real reserve left when Dara actually fell. His decisions, cutting off tribute, opening a new war, kept moving forward and generating consequences long after Justin himself had lost the capacity to manage them. The empire didn't pause to wait for him to recover. It quietly adapted around him instead. That's worth remembering the next time you watch someone make a big, confident decision. In politics, in a company, or anywhere else power and consequence are separated by time. The consequences of that decision don't pause and wait politely to see whether the person who made it can actually handle what comes next. Sometimes, like Justin, they simply can't, and the people and institutions around them, a wife, a trusted officer, an entire palace staff, are the ones left quietly improvising a way through it, usually without ever being given credit for holding things together at all.